Greetings. I'm Michelle Jamrisko, Senior Asia Economy Reporter for Bloomberg News. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. I have just a few notes to start. First, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners, and the Society pays its respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Asia Society also welcomes and acknowledges any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or First Nations people joining our forum today. The Society encourages you to watch our full welcome to country delivered from Melbourne in the Kulin Nation, on demand and accessible below. You will also find a welcome message from Asia Society and other pre-recorded content available to watch. Second, please feel free to submit questions via the chat box. I'll look to pull those during the session, and you'll also be asked, as in other sessions today, to respond to a polling question on the screen. Finally, this session is presented with Forum Platinum partner, Health and Happiness Group. In this panel, we're bringing together business and policy leaders to explore how COVID-19, geopolitical tensions, and rapid digitization are changing how we trade. With all these cross currents, there's plenty to talk about today, so I want to briefly introduce our panelists that we have with us. We have here Michael Byrne, Australia's International Freight Coordinator General. We have Deborah Elms, Founder and Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center. We have Maggie Zhou, Managing Director of Australia New Zealand for Alibaba. And lastly, we have Nick Mann, Managing Director for H&H Group. So welcome to all of you, and I'd like to kick it off and just jump right into the first question. This is for all of you, but maybe we can start with Michael first. What is the single biggest lesson that this year has taught us about the resilience and the fragility of supply chains? Maybe we'll jump to a second panelist while we let Michael get his audio fixed. Deborah, would you like to take that question?
I'm sorry, Michelle, repeat the question. I apologize.
Sure. So what is the single biggest, with all that we've had this year, all that we've had to process COVID on top of all the other factors that were already in play for global trade in a fractious year, what is the single biggest lesson you think we should all have learned about resilience and fragility in supply chains?
I think it's hard to distill it to one, but number one, I suppose, would be you need to have visibility on your supply chain, whether you are a large global giant or you are a very small company that didn't even know that you had a supply chain. I think it's extremely important for you to know where your products come from, raw materials, components, parts, and where they go to, and how they get between your firm and your customers and you and your suppliers. So I think that visibility is becoming increasingly critical for firms.
And Maggie, I mean, this is something that I'm sure you've been dealing with all year firsthand from a business perspective. I mean, how would you kind of digest the lesson learned from resilience and fragility?
Well, with no doubt, I think 2020 is a challenging year, especially for supply chain. During the initial lockdown in China earlier this year, we saw a number of Australian businesses encounter challenges sourcing materials such as product packaging, right? So later we also see significant disruptions relating to air freight of an export and import between Australia and China, due to the suspensions of so many passenger flights between the two countries, which play a key role in moving air freight. At one point, importing via air freight from China was about 10 times the rate pre-COVID-19. However, what we did see was just how quickly businesses adapted to this new environment. For example, some of our local clients in Australia sourced domestically manufactured packaging materials. And many brands also quickly moved away from air freight-based export to China and then utilized Alibaba's bonded warehouse model to warehouse products in China. So the speed of how quickly so many businesses were able to adapt really surprised all of us. Maybe Nick can tell more.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Nick, and of course we'll get to in a bit just what exactly businesses have been doing to kind of tackle these challenges. But Nick, what do you think about the biggest lesson this year from supply chain resilience?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And look, I echo Maggie's sentiment. Certainly, from a downstream perspective, Australian brands selling into China, particularly those that did rely on passenger freight, was severely impacted. But I think the most important thing that we learned is 2020 really put a spotlight on perhaps the fragility of our supply chains. Because I think over the last couple of decades, maybe our supply chains have been perhaps lulled into a slight false sense of security. We're now so good at forecasting. We've got better control over what used to disrupt us, like strikes and transport challenges. And I think what that forced us all to do is we disintegrated our supply chains. And then every single link in the supply chain became very specific. We drove inventory down at each point, and we drove costs down, obviously. And that was great. It drove our COGS down a lot. But then a black swan event like COVID-19 just exposes us to how fragile it is. I mean, Swiss is a really good example. Some of our products have up to 70 ingredients from 4 different continents. Each one is regulated, right? So we've got a very complicated supply chain. So on one hand, it put a spotlight on the fragility of that, but quite amazingly, we had very little disruption, and we were amazed with how adaptive and resilient the supply chains really were. But ultimately, when you have such a complex supply chain that really has been compartmentalized so much over the years, it just gets back to that really close working relationships, lots of sharing of information, and those great open and honest partnerships. And like we have obviously with Alibaba and a lot of other organizations downstream as well.
Well, when you use a word like disintegrate, I think that still really underlines the dramatic changes that we're going through this year. Michael, do we still have you on the line? Are you available to comment on the single biggest lesson this year for resilience and fragility in supply chains?
Yes. So I am back. Something happened then, but first of all, I think that supply chains are much more fragile than people think. Take air freight. There were 9,000 outbound international aircraft out of Australia in January of this year, and then in April there was 1,200. There was about 20 international airports in Australia, and in April only 2 had airplanes.
Wow.
So if you look at it was, and 30% of planes were going out of Sydney. Now with a much smaller number, it's 54%. So there's only actually one airport that stands on its own 2 feet in Australia, which is Sydney. None of the other airports do. So they're much more fragile. And someone like me at Toll and Linfox has spent 30 years offshoring, outsourcing, long line manufacturing, contracting inventories extremely hard, and there's just no give in a lot of the systems, and they are still being heavily supported around the world by governments. And you look at the amount of money that's being put into international airlines. I think it's 84 billion in the US, 18 billion euros for Lufthansa, 10 billion for Air France KLM. The air freight network basically only survives at the moment based on support. So they're much more fragile than everyone thinks, in my view.
Well, I definitely want to get back to that. And of course, you have a seat looking at the high-level logistics of the whole country and interacting with the international freight environment. So I definitely want to hit on that in a bit. But I do want to get back to the business perspective for a moment, if I could. So for Maggie and Nick specifically, I mean, we had, as we mentioned, so much to deal with heading into this year in terms of kind of a complete rethinking of the global trade framework, whether you think about institutions or bilateral relationships, and of course, on the business level, dealing with tariffs and the question thereof. I mean, how did you each approach, different strategies this year? What concretely do you think made the most difference in terms of how you operate in the trade level? Maybe Maggie first.
Yeah. Okay. For us, actually, whatever that is for our globalization and to help the business how to be more resilient and then to embrace the future. So that is, I think, today the world is full of uncertainty, but especially after COVID-19. But maybe there is one thing can give you strong confidence, that's digitalization. So for Alibaba, our mission is always to make easy to do business anywhere. But now today, after 20 years growth of Alibaba, our mission is to make easy to do business anywhere in the digital era. So that is a strategy in the future, I think, is that we're around the technology, how to enable the business to make easy to do business anywhere. So our strategy today, we now is that we still understand in China, the domestic consumption is still very big. So that is also, I think, will be beneficial for all the country who want to export to China market. And the other part is that today actually is for we say cloud computing. It's the cloud computing intelligence. So maybe the big data data cannot be shared, but data intelligence can be shared, and that will be useful for many retailers to structure better for their future info supply chain in that country, in that market, right? So the other part is digitization. So that's and always that is for our Alibaba's strategy in this year, and we were more focused on digitalization to support the business.
Well, certainly a lot of doubling down of the digital economy, I think, has been a strategy of many businesses. I mean, Nick, what did you guys do at H&H Group? What did you tackle this year concretely in terms of adapting to these changes?
Yeah, look, I guess there's two sides of things. So obviously from a commercial perspective and a route to market, that strategy was kind of put on its head, wasn't it? And we all needed to pivot, which is our new favorite word, in response. But if we're talking specifically about impact on supply chain strategy, and I was having a chat to our global head of supply who suggested my forecasting hasn't been very good as a result. And I think that's a very, very fair call. It's been, the demand signals have been all over the place, and that's been a real challenge for our supply chain. But again, back to my earlier point, by having a deep partnership with our suppliers, we did have to build our inventory levels, but we built it with a joint risk with our supply chain partners. We bought raw materials, not finished goods, together, which gave us a lot more flexibility, so we could see where the demand settled, and we could have a more adequate supply to meet the demand. But again, deep partnerships, sharing challenges, and dividing our risk on the back of some very horrible forecasting, which obviously puts a lot of strain on many parts of the business.
I'm hearing you emphasize the deep relationships, and I'm wondering, maybe we can get to it later, but how you're able to develop these deep relationships in a time when we're interacting like this. Some people have said that one of the big losses this year has not being able to meet in person to kind of develop those relationships. But hopefully you will have had more luck in doing so in your business ventures. I do want to bring in Michael and Deb for now. And I want to ask a little bit on institutions. I know you both deal with businesses quite frequently, and maybe you have some thoughts on what Maggie and Nick were outlining from your perspective. But I want to ask about institutions and how much can we lean on the old ways of doing things? We think about things like the WTO and the trade relationships that we used to have. Obviously, there's a rethink on how we do that, and some countries are very loud about how they want to change that. But what do you think is going to be kept in the years to come that we won't lose out of this era that's kind of fracturing the way we do business and the way we do trade? Maybe Michael, could you take that first?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question. I'm sure that there's a lot of concern, no doubt, from extraterritorial jurisdictional institutions like the WTO about what countries are doing. There's a lot of discussion about contribution to airlines, support of airlines, nationalisation, because that's what it is in the main. Then there's a lot of discussions going on about what the new supply chains will look like, particularly around things deemed by different sovereign nations in their national interest. I don't think that's all played out yet. I think that that's got a long way to go, particularly as countries reevaluate what they deem in their own national interest. Now, that can be as simple as an airport, to an airline, to a product, to a sector, to a manufacturing type. And I think there'll be a lot of really tough discussions over the ensuing years on that. And I think there'll be in some ways, there will have to be a different framework of what is deemed compliant or not. And I think that the political class will have to spend a fair bit of time looking at that and debating that in Geneva and other places. I don't think that is a very simple pathway at the moment.
Right, very, very much in flux still then. Is that the way you would agree with it, Deb? Is that how you would outline it? Or do you have any more or less faith in the trade institutions?
Well, I think Michael has identified some particular challenges that will have to be addressed coming out of COVID. One of them is the subsidies issue. So we have seen a lot of government intervention in a lot of different markets and sectors in ways that we hadn't seen in the past. We had already had a long-standing debate, particularly between countries, about the appropriate level of subsidies by governments and the inappropriate kinds of subsidies by government, because it gives unfair advantages to some economies while it gives no advantages at all to others, particularly poorer developing countries. And so this subsidy argument is going to be very important going forward, and we'll see a lot of discussions about subsidies. But I think Michael was also right to point out the extent to which we are in a new space with new kinds of concerns being raised. National security is one of them. This is a mechanism that many governments are using to avoid what would otherwise have been their obligations. So you said you're in the middle of a lot of tension if you're a government. On the one hand, you want to make sure that you're protecting jobs and employment domestically. On the other hand, you're watching, trade flows that are disrupted. You're watching firms that are scrambling and so forth. And so that tension, which is always there between open and closed economies, is getting worse. And as we go forward, I think you're going to see that tension rise more. And so we've got this internal tension in economies, in every economy this time, which is unusual. And that level of change is going to result in some real problems for the global economy. And it will leave firms, just to finish this section up, it will leave firms, I think, looking for opportunities to home. And in particular, especially what we've been working on, is helping firms use other kinds of trade mechanisms, and in particular trade agreements, as one way for them to lower the risk of engaging in trade and increase the certainty and increase their own competitiveness compared to others who have been not using trade agreements or who use them poorly. So there will be a reshuffling, I think, at the institutional level while we grapple with some of these big stressors. It will take some time for that to sort out at the global level. And so the default will be closer to home, regional agreements, bilateral agreements, where firms, if they're smart, will start leveraging on these opportunities. And particularly for companies coming in and out of Australia, the good news is that the Australian government has done a good job of connecting Australia to other economies through all different kinds of trade agreements. Most of them are quite good for firms. They're deep, they're broad, they're comprehensive, and they're very useful.
Well, thank you for that, Deb. It actually helps me kind of segue into something I wanted to ask Michael about taking it down from global institutions to the government level. You've got an interesting position this year. I don't know if everyone's familiar with what the Coordinator General of International Freight was intended to do, but you certainly have an interesting insight into the business operations, of course, your steep logistics background, but also as a government appointee. I'm wondering if you can say something about the relationship between business and government right now. I mean, in a time like this, obviously businesses have to move very quickly to adapt, and a lot of them are making very short-term decisions. Meanwhile, at the worldwide level, as you mentioned, some institutions will be thinking about how to change the practices of trade for years to come. So that's more of a long-term, discussion and project. But I mean, how would you describe the relationship between government and business right now around trade, and how are you kind of tackling the evolution of that relationship?
So we're particularly focused where I am on agriculture and aquaculture, and and I would say that, and I've been in logistics all my life, I think that the relationship between federal government, state government, and the food and agri section or sector is probably better than I've ever seen it. I think that we would have meetings with the states and the state ag departments basically every day. We would have meetings with the associations, from rock lobster to stone fruit to the Meat and Livestock Association. I think people are more engaged than I've ever seen in my working life, probably because the problem is so big. Probably because when you've gone from 9,000 flights to 1,200, when you've gone from 14 or 15 international airports to 2, when Melbourne Airport's gone from 800 flights to 70 in a week, everyone is starstruck. And I think that, in my view, I haven't seen government, federal government, state government associations and industry work this well. And also, which has surprised me, and Francis is on the phone, I know that, what is working so well for this program is that we have 8 departments in this one, and I'm told that's pretty unusual as well, that everyone sort of works this closely together, this quickly, on a day-to-day basis. But I think that's just a sign of how troubled this area has been and is.
Well, Nick, I want to bring you in for kind of a business perspective on this. I mean, has your relationship with government officials changed at all this year? I mean, are you relying or communicating with them more than you usually would?
Look, I think, H&H Group, or Swiss in particular, we've enjoyed a healthy and productive relationship with pretty much all areas of government. And I think during COVID, I think the communication's been increased and it's been great. We've had, help clearing products locally and through international ports, which we're really appreciative of. So, and not to mention, obviously, the communication on how to keep our teams safe. But look, I think more so recent federal budget announcements about support for R&D, 100% asset write-off, and the $1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy and modernisation fund are really important, because it's going to mean that we can, in a sense, de-risk a little bit of our supply chain. We can onshore a little bit more, and because it starts with R&D, we can go end to end with that. So, look, I think it's been challenging, but certainly it's brought us closer to federal government and also, federal opposition as well. So, yes, we've been quite grateful.
It's an ongoing discussion, I assume. Maggie, I want to get back to you because you mentioned the digital economy, and we know that has been one big winner out of COVID. So I want to ask you, I mean, of course, Alibaba is square at the heart of this. What could you have learned this year that you didn't know about digitization, or what new priorities might you have now that you didn't before? And if you have any, case for those that are not on e-commerce, what would you say to businesses that have kind of struggled to get on that path, or have kind of resisted selling products online?
Okay, I think for all the business globally, one of the key success factors on how adaptable and how resilient businesses were to the new environment. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the digitalization of business models for so many retailers and exporters. In the innovation and new digital infrastructure, born over the COVID-19 period will be long-lasting and game-changing. So you can see those businesses who pivoted to online business during COVID-19 still survive and even survive better, right? And here in Australia, we work with more than 2,000 Australian brands, helping them export to China market. And we have seen the resilience of businesses as they adapted their supply chains, look at how to digitize their businesses, and embrace the new ways to engage consumers. 4 years ago, our founder, Jack Ma, has mentioned 5 news will change the world. So those 5 news are new retail, new manufacturing, new finance, new technology, and new energy. And we have started new retail first, and recently just launched the new manufacturing. In Alibaba, very interesting, our business all about an animal. Each business, there is one animal represent one business. So the new manufacturing recently launched is rhino, right? Very interesting animal. So these 2 news are all about supply chain rebuild. So first of all, new retail, I think many of the audience, maybe if you went to China, you may have already experienced our fresh apple, Hema, fresh, right? So this new retail concept is about online, offline combined together. And all the actually, it's all the core about the new retail is about the service, how you can give the better service experience for the consumer, right? So today, actually, in our new retail model in China for fresh apple store, 60% of the users they shop on the app, and 40% is just we still go to the physical store. But the COVID-19 actually shifting that a lot. When people just venturing and just less just outdoor, and they staying at home, they will just prefer to shop through the app to buy all the necessities what they need and for the daily essential products, right? So it's very interesting about the rebuild of the supply chain, right? So you may think about the fresh apple is just a supermarket, but actually that is all the consumer behavior intelligence behind it. And recently they also opened the store not only for the urban area, but also for the suburb. Those suburb area, those store, and what kind of the inventory we should supply in the store, actually just all according to the big data intelligence about how the consumer would prefer to buy in our Alibaba ecosystem on our Taobao and the Tmall platform, and then they can just to supply all the need what the citizen just like to buy just around this area, right? So this is the new, and recently also to supply the office, right? So they those office lady and men, as they are so busy every day for breakfast and afternoon tea, and they can book just on the subway. And when they just off the subway, just and get the breakfast from the vending machine. This we call the Hema pick and go. So this is all about the rebuild. And for new manufacturing, I think it's very interesting about the supply rebuild. It is transforming from actually last century. I think if we talk about the supply chain, and that is all about the large scale and standardized products and all the business, because I still remember in 1970s in China, in my childhood, every family had the quota coupon for meat, for rice, for milk, for beans, right? So at that ages, I think the supply is smaller than the demand, right? So you need to do that like that. So all the business just manufacture what they want and to supply to the market, right? But today, actually, all the consumers are more and more sophisticated, right? So thousands consumer maybe have the thousands demand, right? So how to meet those consumers' demand is the most important topic for all the businesses. So the new manufacturing actually is shifting or maybe transforming from last century, from the large scale standardized products to today to the small scale and the customized products for the consumer. So that's called actually from B2C to C2B, from the consumer to the business, right? But Alibaba, you know, we have so many, today actually we have about 870 million users, even on the mobile, right? So those consumer behavior, we can understand better about their intelligence, what they need, what they want. And then we can just manufacture what the consumer needed. So that's called the new manufacturer. I think it also will be the future supply chain model. And if all the ways go to digitized, and actually you will better understand your consumer and will supply better for your consumer. And another surprising factor through the COVID-19 pandemic in China was the growth of live streaming as a means of brand engaging with their audience. KOLs, online influencers, increasingly work with brands and to market products online by their Taobao live shopfront. And furthermore, in China, many heads of the villages have started to help farmers to promote the vegetable, fruit, and the specialties through live streaming. And in February this year, I think we saw live streaming increased by over 100%. I believe live streaming will also become a digital marketing tool in Australian market, since more and more millennials are getting used to shoppertainment online. And today, just lack of the digital talent in the market, right? Huge demand, huge opportunity.
Yeah, I did want to get back to the Australia question. I mean, it is interesting. You were mentioning the 40% that are, still going to the brick and mortar, or were still going to the brick and mortar. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves post-COVID when people are able to get out if they'd like to. I do want to turn. We don't have too much time left. I do have to get one polling question in here, and then I'd like to take a question from the audience if I can. The audience poll question first, though, is which country in the region presents the biggest opportunity for Australian business? We have another question on the screens. There is a new push for greater domestic economic sovereignty. How should this be achieved? You have your options right there. Government investment in strategic companies, create stockpiles of essential goods and oil reserves, encourage trade and supply chain diversification, build domestic manufacturing base, all of the above, or not necessary, none of the above. So please do register your responses. And we'll just give a couple minutes to that. While we have that running, if I could ask the panelists, we do have a number of questions coming in from the dashboard. And we have one interesting one. Harold Weldon of Weldon Global asks, will blockchain emerge as part of a solution for seamless multilateral trade? Does anyone want to kind of tackle a blockchain related question?
I'll take the multilateral portion. That answer is no. It may emerge at some point at the multilateral platform level, but it will be some period in the distant future. And that is because you're dealing, in order to get that to happen at the multilateral level, governments would have to approve it, or governments would have to allow it to happen and then not regulate. But I think more likely they would have to approve this. And for many government officials globally, they have no idea what you are even talking about when you use the word blockchain, and they don't understand how it would work, and they're not convinced that this is a good thing. So I suspect that the rollout of multilateral blockchain is going to be slower than certainly companies would like it to be. And then where it will come, I think, is through specific applications. So we'll see it in trade financing potentially, or in other kinds of bank transaction information, potentially between suppliers. But it will not come because government intended it to happen. It will sort of bloom, I think, and then government will have to come and, regulate what that looks like. So at the multilateral level, going to be tricky. In Australia and in other areas will be much more likely. Again, as businesses develop applications that make sense, then government will have to come in behind them, make sure that the regulatory space makes sense. I think that's how blockchain will evolve.
It's interesting. You and I are here in Singapore, Deb, where we know the government is thinking a little bit more forward thinking about blockchain and other things, yes, especially from the central bank, but not the same as elsewhere in the world, maybe a little bit further than that. Unfortunately, I do have to wrap up. If we could just check the polling answers, let's see how people responded to our question. Okay, so it seems to be the winner is encourage trade and supply chain diversification, with a second as all of the above. So I think businesses certainly have their handful this year, and a lot of options into how this can be achieved. So just to close, we now move into the final public component of today's program, the wrap-up, and it's my pleasure to hand over to the Asia Society Australian Chairman, Doug Ferguson, to make some concluding remarks and for a special announcement. Stay tuned after Doug, as we'll hand off to my colleague, Ed Johnson, Managing Editor of News in Australia for Bloomberg, and Asia Society's own Greg Earl, who will both discuss some of the highlights from today's forum and conduct one final audience poll. So, Doug, welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle. And what an interesting discussion on probably one of the biggest topics of the year, disruption to supply chains. Thanks to Michael, to Deborah, to Nick, and of course our Advisory Council member, Maggie. Well, I had to break through a firewall, so apologies. I'm working off my phone, and it's a classic example of 2020. Anything that could go wrong does go wrong, but so many serious health issues, environmental issues with bushfires, geopolitical regional issues, and now economic challenges that Australia faces, all coming at us from once. And frankly, I don't know about you, but it just feels at times overwhelming that we have to deal and absorb with so much information that's coming from divergent viewpoints from different governments and different political leaders and media commentators. So that's why the Asia Briefing Live, although it's a big investment of our time, is such an important contribution, and really wanted to thank Bloomberg, who've been such a stellar partner for us over the last 3 years in this series. It's a unique opportunity for us to join with Australia and the world's leading thinkers and leaders around a series of discussions to really go into what are the hottest topics of 2020 and look forward to what might be coming us next year. Our core audience traditionally is the most senior and influential business leaders and academic leaders and government leaders across the nation, if not the world. This year, I'm very pleased we've adapted to opening Asia Briefing Live up to a much larger public audience, and I think we had 400 people at the Asia Briefing Live event earlier in the year, and this one's well over 550. So, a great opportunity to reach a much broader audience for the Asia Society. It's been now probably our biggest Asia Briefing Live, certainly the most number of speakers, with over 30 speakers and more than half of the speakers joining us from international locations. So a great effort, and it's been reflected in such an interesting discussion today. Thank you to all registered guests who've joined us. I hope you found today a really useful investment of your time. I've certainly been tuning into most of the sessions and found it incredibly useful. Thanks also to our trusted and reliable, hardworking board, advisory council, and our corporate partners and members and individual members who've joined us today. I'd sincerely like to thank all of the speakers and the moderators from the Bloomberg team for today's event. The quality of the discussion has been of the highest order, and I think it reflects the diversity of experience and perspective, and for me, it's been a really useful learning exercise. I'd like to thank Bloomberg, as I mentioned before, who've been our shoulder-to-shoulder partner over the last 3 years, and in particular Ed Johnson, who's the managing editor for Australia and New Zealand for Bloomberg News, and also for lending us all of your amazing team. Such a great lineup. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Victorian State Government, who are our foundation partner, and that of Platinum event partners H&H Group, known as Swiss, and the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. A special thank you to the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, who've performed in a pre-recorded concert performance, I might add, a beautiful piece of music that's been flowing throughout the day. Also to the Asia Society team, led by Philip, ably supported by Jet Radley, and a big team behind the scenes, Rocco, our artist, all the IT support. I do have some important news to share. This will be my last Asia Briefing Live as the chairman of the Asia Society in Australia. As of the 27th of November, at the conclusion of the AGM, I'll be stepping down after 5 years as chairman and 2 years before that as the deputy chairman. And I did want to take this opportunity to address the broader audience, and also to talk about some of the great things that I think we have achieved. I'm extremely happy with the progress that's been made over the last 5 years under the leadership of Philip, with good by Warwick Smith AO, our global trustee, and the board of directors, who have been so supportive and incredibly hard-working. Some of the highlights to reflect on: we now have a permanent Asia Society Australia Centre in Melbourne, thanks to the generous support of the Victorian State Government, and that was officially launched by Premier Andrews last year. We also have launched the Asia Society Policy Institute, again in 2019, led by the fabulous Richard Maud and also Patrick Suckling. This Asia Briefing Live series, again in the third of its seasons, we've hosted Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Foreign Minister Maurice Payne. We've hosted Shadow Treasurer of the time, Chris Bowen, PM&C Secretary Martin Parkinson, Peter Varghese. The list goes on and on. So many ambassadors, so many leading thinkers. There's such a crown and the jewel of the Asia Society. We've also hosted the Asia 21 program in Melbourne, recognising and celebrating outstanding leadership from emerging leaders around the world. We hosted the 20th anniversary of the Asia Society in Sydney in 2017, featuring the Honourable John Howard, who gave a very memorable speech reflecting on where it all began. The Asia Society Fellowship Program was initiated with Tom Lembong, the inaugural fellow, and now Manoj Kohli from India, a known venture capitalist, as the latest. A lot of things that have happened, ladies and gentlemen, which we're all very proud of. We have a shared vision for the Asia Society to be the leading centre in our country for engaging with Asia across business, policy, arts and society. We have a mission to try to develop the debate and also the leaders for the future. So we're well on the way, but as they say, work is never achieved, and we're about to set forth on a new 5-year plan, which will take us out to 2026, and I feel that is the time to refresh the chairmanship. So, drum roll please. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to publicly announce that our board, led by an independent process led by Andrew Michelmore and Swathi Dave, has universally elected Stuart Fuller as our next chairman, and that has been endorsed by our global trustee Warwick and our global chairman Heng Chi, who spoke earlier today. And Stuart will become the 4th chairman of the Asia Society in the past 23 years when he starts at the end of November. Stuart is very well known to many of you. He's a highly recognised legal practitioner, former global managing partner of King & Wood Mallesons, has lived in Hong Kong and worked across the region for decades. Interestingly, his wife and his children are of Malaysian Chinese heritage, so he truly understands Asia. He's got a real passion for it, and I think his intellect and his energy for the role will be matched by not many others in Australia, and I think he's a fine choice. Stuart's new role is Global Head of Law for KPMG, and he served on the Asia Society board for 3 years, which makes him work very well known to our board and to our members, and he'll do an outstanding job working with Philip and the executive team. You will have an opportunity to meet Stuart, I'm sure, in the next month, but given that we're able to finalise all matters relating to his appointment, I wanted to use this opportunity in front of a large public audience to thank and congratulate Stuart for stepping up. It's a big role. It's a hell of an enjoyable role, but it's an important role as well as we move into our next phase. So with that, please join me in thanking Stuart, and I'm sure he will draw on your support and encouragement. But with that, it's now my great pleasure to pass back to Ed Johnson and also our own Greg Earl to do the debrief. Thanks for your time, and stay safe and well.